Imagine a fragmented land, where each community acts on its own, without unified leadership to establish justice or guide the nation. This was the setting for Israel during the Age of Judges, a period described by the Bible as a time when everyone did what was right in his own eyes. After the death of Joshua, the leader who had led the people in conquering the Promised Land, Israel found itself in a power vacuum. Without a central authority to unite the tribes, the nation fell into repetitive cycles of disobedience to divine commands, oppression by neighboring nations, and eventual redemption through God-raised leaders. These leaders, known as judges, were temporary, charismatic figures who emerged in times of crisis, but their actions rarely brought lasting peace. The result was a chaotic and unpredictable period, where fragile alliances and internal disputes weakened national cohesion. The tribes, in their autonomy, often faced difficulties working together, creating an environment conducive to conflicts and tragedies. This era of instability not only reflected a lack of political structure, but also exposed the moral fragility of a society that had strayed from divine principles. Without the figure of a king or solid leadership to guide the people, justice was subjective, and decisions made by individuals or groups often resulted in disastrous consequences. Amidst the confusion and chaos that characterized the Age of Judges, a specific story emerges that illustrates the tragedies and consequences of a disordered society. This narrative begins with a Levite, a member of the tribe destined for religious service in Israel, who lived in the mountains of Ephraim. This Levite had a concubine, a woman who shared a close relationship with him, although of lower status than a wife. The relationship between the two, however, faced tensions. One day the concubine, for reasons that were not completely clear, decided to leave him and return to her father's house, in Bethlehem in Judah. After 4 months, driven by longing and the desire for reconciliation, the Levite decided to go in search of her. This decision marked the beginning of a journey that would bring to light not only the complexity of human relationships, but also the darker aspects of a society without cohesion or moral direction. The Levite's journey to the woman's father's house was marked by determination. He took with him a faithful servant and 2 donkeys, prepared to demonstrate that he was willing to repair the relationship. Upon arriving, he was warmly received by his father-in-law, who, in a gesture of hospitality, insisted that he stay there for a few days. During our stay, the days turned into celebrations, shared meals and conversations. However, his father-in-law's hesitation to let him go would soon become a prelude to the dark events that would follow. The Levite, impatient to return to his homeland, decided to resume his journey, taking with him the reconciled concubine and her servant. This beginning, filled with hope and reconciliation, quickly gives way to a sequence of events that expose the deep flaws of a society in disarray, culminating in one of the most disturbing narratives in the book of Judges. After a long and exhausting journey, the Levite, his concubine and his servant arrived at the city of Gibeah, which belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. The day was coming to an end, and the group, already tired, needed to find shelter before night fell. In Israeli culture at that time, offering hospitality to travelers was considered a sacred virtue. Receiving and caring for those passing through was not only a gesture of kindness, but also a moral and spiritual duty. However, Gibeah showed no such hospitality. The city, apparently prosperous and well located, was immersed in an atmosphere of indifference. The Levite and his entourage headed to the central square, a place where travelers often awaited help from locals. However, no one approached to offer shelter. It was a strange and unsettling silence, which contrasted with the principles of generosity and compassion that should be practiced among the children of Israel. The refusal to help was not only an act of negligence, but also a reflection of the moral decay of society in Gibeah. A city where hospitality had disappeared was a city where fundamental values were corrupt. This neglect of travelers highlighted Gibeah's disconnection with God's precepts, revealing a disconcerted and selfish community, indifferent to the needs of others. When the situation seemed desperate and the group was beginning to consider spending the night outdoors, an old man arrived at the square. He was not a native of Gibeah, but of the mountains of Ephraim, just like the Levite. Upon seeing the group, he immediately realized that they were travelers seeking shelter. Moved by empathy and genuine concern, the old man approached and began asking questions: where they came from, where they were going, and why they were there. After hearing the Levite's story, the old man promptly offered shelter in his home. This simple but profound gesture was a stark contrast to the cold attitude of the inhabitants of Gibeah. He knew that letting someone stay overnight in the square was dangerous and unacceptable, especially in a city where the rules of hospitality seemed to have been forgotten. Taking the group to his home, the elder showed that, even in times of moral decadence, there were still those who valued the principles of kindness and protection. He not only opened the doors of his house, but also offered food and water to the Levite, the concubine, the servant, and even the donkeys who accompanied them. He made sure everyone felt comfortable, showing a generosity that was both admirable and rare in Gibeah. Inside the house, the group was finally able to relax. They shared a meal, talked about the journey, and for a brief moment they felt safe, far from the dangers that awaited them outside. However, the old man seemed to know that the security his hospitality offered was fragile. He insisted that they not sleep outdoors, showing a concern that suggested something was wrong in the city. As the night progressed, the tranquility of the house was shaken. The city's initial indifference would quickly turn into something much darker. The elder's gesture of hospitality, which should be a sacred and protected act, would soon be tested by a threat that would reveal Gibeah's most cruel and inhumane side. The lack of hospitality among locals was just the surface of a much deeper problem. The city, which showed no compassion towards travelers, would show its true face, a community in complete moral collapse, where safety, dignity, and the most basic values were irreparably compromised. The night in Gibeah finally seemed peaceful inside the old man's house. The Levite, his concubine, and the servant were sheltered, fed, and apparently safe after hours of uncertainty and challenges. However, this calm was abruptly shattered by ominous sounds coming from outside. A group of men from the city, known as sons of Belial, a term that in biblical culture designated wicked, rebellious, and unprincipled individuals, surrounded the house. They began banging on the door violently, while shouting, demanding that the Levite be handed over. Their intention was explicit: to subjugate and violate the traveler, dehumanizing him in a cruel way. This behavior reflected not only Gibeah's moral degeneration, but also the collapse of essential values such as justice, hospitality, and protection of others, which should be pillars of Israelite society. Inside the house, the old man and his guests were overcome by fear. The elder, in a desperate gesture to protect the Levite, considered sacred as a guest under his tutelage, went out to try to talk to the men. He begged them not to commit such evil, appealing to the principles of decency and fraternity that still remained in the tradition of the people of Israel. However, his words were in vain. The attackers were determined to carry out their vile act and were not persuaded. Faced with their refusal to back down, the elder made a controversial and disturbing offer. In an attempt to spare the Levite, he offered his own virgin daughter and the guest's concubine as substitutes. Although this act would be unthinkable by modern standards, in the context of the time it reflects desperation and belief in the inviolability of male hospitality. The men rejected any alternative other than the Levite himself. Faced with increasing pressure and imminent danger for everyone within the house, the Levite took an action that many would consider unthinkable and cruel. He handed over his concubine to the attackers. The woman's fate was terrible. She was dragged outside and brutally raped throughout the night. At dawn, the sounds of violence stopped. When the Levite opened the door, he found his concubine lying on the threshold of the house. Her hands were outstretched towards the threshold, as if in a last desperate gesture she had tried to reach refuge. However, she had not resisted the attacks. His life had been taken in a tragic and inhumane way. The Levite, overcome with horror and possibly remorse, remained silent. He placed the woman's limp body on the donkey and started back to his house. That journey, which began as an attempt at reconciliation, ended in an unimaginable tragedy, carrying with it a symbol of a people in moral collapse. Upon arriving in his land, the Levite performed an act that would shock the entire nation. In a gesture that was both symbolic and brutal, he divided the concubine's body into 12 parts and sent each of them to the tribes of Israel. Each piece carried a clear message: moral degradation and injustice had reached an unsustainable level. The outrage was immediate and spread across the country. The body parts became a warning cry that could not be ignored. The tribes were called upon to react and seek justice for the crime committed in Gibeah. The act of sending the concubine's body parts to the tribes of Israel provoked an immediate and unified reaction. The Levite's brutal gesture was understood as a call to justice, a cry against the moral degradation that had taken over Gibeah and, by extension, the people of Israel itself. The message was clear: something terrible had happened, and a response could not be avoided. The 12 tribes of Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, met in an extraordinary council in the city of Mizpah. The meeting was described as one of the most significant in the history of the people of Israel, with leaders from all tribes present. 400,000 armed men, ready for battle, formed the congregation. There was a feeling of collective outrage, mixed with a sense of urgency to restore justice and order. At the council, the Levite was called to report what had happened. He recounted the events of Gibeah, describing how the men of the city had surrounded the house and committed a vile act that resulted in the death of his concubine. His words, filled with pain and indignation, galvanized the tribal leaders, who recognized the gravity of the situation. The tribes decided to take coordinated action against Gibeah and the Benjamites, who had allowed such an atrocity to happen in their territory. Before leaving for the confrontation, they sent messengers to the tribe of Benjamin, demanding that those responsible for the crime be handed over so that they could be punished. The message was firm: this act of cruelty could not be tolerated, and the evil needed to be purged from Israel. However, the leaders of the tribe of Benjamin refused to cooperate. Instead of handing over the culprits, they chose to protect the inhabitants of Gibeah. This decision not only aggravated the indignation of the other tribes, but also brought the Benjamites into direct confrontation with the rest of Israel. With Benjamin's refusal to mete out justice, the remaining tribes concluded that there was no other option than to declare war. The unity that initially sought to restore justice was now turning into a collective effort to address Israel's internal corruption. What began as a search for justice for the concubine's death evolved into a conflict that would engulf the entire nation, revealing the deep divisions between the tribes. The war that would ensue would not only be a battle against the Benjamites, but also a fight for Israel's own future, confronting the limits of its unity and morality as a chosen people. With Benjamin's refusal to hand over those responsible for Gibeah's barbaric act, the other tribes of Israel saw no alternative but to declare war against their own brothers. The conflict was not only a battle for justice, but also an attempt to purge corruption and restore the moral principles that underpinned the identity of the Israelite people. Preparations for war were rapid and massive. Israel gathered an army of 400,000 armed men, while Benjamin, although much smaller in number, managed to mobilize 26,000 warriors, including 700 men from Gibeah known for their extraordinary skill in combat. These warriors were so skilled that they could hurl stones with a sling with deadly accuracy, which gave the Benjamites a strategic advantage, even though they were outnumbered. Before beginning the conflict, Israel sought divine guidance at Bethel, asking the Lord which tribe should lead the attack. The answer was clear: the tribe of Judah must go first. This consultation with divine designs showed the seriousness with which Israel viewed the conflict, recognizing that it was not just a physical war, but also a spiritual fight for the future of its nation. On the first day of battle, the Benjamites demonstrated their strength and skill. Using the mountainous geography to their advantage, they inflicted a devastating defeat on Israel's troops, killing 22,000 men. This result deeply shook Israel's army, but did not weaken its resolve. On the second day, Israel reorganized its forces and again sought God's guidance. Despite renewed confidence, the Benjamites once again prevailed, killing another 18,000 Israelite soldiers. The repetition of defeats led Israel to a moment of deep reflection. The people wept, fasted, and offered sacrifices to the Lord, seeking not only strength, but also understanding about the reason for their defeats. On the third day, Israel changed its strategy. Instead of a direct attack, they planned an ambush. Part of the army feigned a retreat, luring the Benjamites away from their defensive position. Meanwhile, a hidden force of Israelites waited to attack the city of Gibeah. By the time the Benjamites realized the ruse, it was too late. The ambush was effective, and the battle took a decisive turn. The Lord delivered Benjamin into the hands of Israel, as he had promised. The city of Gibeah was invaded, its inhabitants massacred, and a great cloud of smoke rose, signaling total destruction. At the end of the conflict, Benjamin's defeat was crushing. Of the 26,000 warriors who had entered the battle, only 600 managed to escape, taking refuge in the rock of Rimmon. Israel, in its quest for justice, almost completely exterminated one of the 12 tribes. The Civil War was a tragic milestone in Israel's history. Although justice was served in relation to Gibeah's crime, the cost was enormous. Sibling violence has revealed the deep divisions at the heart of the nation and raised difficult questions about morality, leadership, and the future of God's people. After the massacre that devastated the Benjamites, only 600 men remained who fled to the Rock of Rimmon, an isolated place that was difficult to access. There, they remained hidden for 4 months, while the rest of Israel reflected on what had happened. The conflict that had begun as a search for justice had almost led to the complete extermination of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. With the war over, the Israelites turned their attention to the oath made before the conflict. None of their daughters would be given as wives to the Benjamites. This vote, coupled with the tribe's near annihilation, created a new dilemma: how to preserve Benjamin's lineage and prevent an entire tribe from disappearing from Israel. The emotional impact of this scenario was profound. Gathered at Bethel, the people of Israel wept bitterly before the Lord. They mourned the loss of their brothers and asked God why such a misfortune had happened, to the point that a tribe was about to become extinct. Despite their military victory, the weight of the destruction and the realization that the unity of God's people was in danger led them to repentance. Seeking a solution, Israelite leaders began planning how to preserve the tribe of Benjamin without breaking the oath made at Mizpah. The first idea was to identify which cities in Israel had not sent men to fight against Gibeah. It turned out that the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead had not participated in the war. In a controversial decision, Israel sent 12,000 warriors to attack Jabesh-Gilead, killing all the men and women who were not virgins. From this action, 400 virgin women were spared, who were given to the surviving Benjamites as wives. However, this number was not enough to repopulate the tribe. So Israel's leaders sought an additional solution. They remembered an annual festival in Shiloh where young Israelites participated in dances in vineyards. The Benjamites were instructed to ambush young women during the festival and capture them to take as wives. In this way, the oath made at Mizpah would not technically be violated, since women would not be handed over by their parents, but taken by force. Although this solution preserved the tribe of Benjamin, it was achieved through morally questionable means, revealing the complexity and bitter consequences of their actions. The people of Israel, in seeking to correct one mistake, ended up making others, illustrating the difficulty of dealing with the consequences of hasty decisions and reckless oaths. In the end, the Benjamites were able to return to their lands, rebuild their cities, and start over as a tribe. However, the trauma of the Civil War and the extreme measures taken to preserve Benjamin left deep scars on the people of Israel, both in their morality and in their unity as a nation. With the reconstruction of Benjamin and the end of the conflict, Israel tried to move forward. However, the Gibeah episode left deep scars on the nation's identity. The near extinction of a tribe, the brutality of the Civil War, and the morally questionable decisions that followed were a painful reminder of the chaos that ensues when there is no firm leadership or an effective justice system. The Book of Judges concludes this narrative with a phrase that echoes throughout history: "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes." This statement summarizes the root cause of the moral and social collapse that led to the events of Gibeah. Without central leadership or a collective moral compass, the people of Israel became lost in cycles of disobedience, violence, and revenge. Gibeah's legacy is a testament to how moral corruption can spread in a directionless society, leading to destruction and suffering. It also serves as a warning to future generations about the importance of shared values, fair leadership, and the protection of the most vulnerable. Furthermore, the episode highlights the fragility of tribal relations in Israel. The Civil War was not only a punishment for Gibeah's crimes, but also a reflection of internal divisions between the tribes. Even after the military victory, the extreme measures to preserve the tribe of Benjamin demonstrated that national unity was still a distant and fragile idea. On the other hand, the story of Gibeah also points to God's mercy in the midst of human chaos. Despite the people's failures, God did not abandon Israel, allowing one of the tribes to be preserved and the nation to have a chance to learn from its mistakes. This narrative invites deep reflection on leadership, morality, and the impact of human decisions. She challenges her readers to think about the consequences of their choices and to recognize that without clear direction and solid values, societies can easily go astray. In the end, the Gibeah episode is more than a story of tragedy, it is a call to transformation. It points to the need for justice, compassion, and leadership that honors divine principles and promotes human dignity. It is a reminder that today's choices shape not only the present, but also the future of a nation.